Attention! By decree of the Lord of Holy Terra and by extension the God Emperor of Mankind, queries into the recorded archives you are requesting are strictly prohibited. By querying such information of a prohibited nature is tantamount to heresy. As an act to such, it is an account the God Emperor is a praying edict. You are thusly a heretic. As a convicted heretic, you're in violation of the following. Article 1073P, DAC 977864/211/.
The incursions boarder took its time leaving the system. A whole day, in fact. There were 3 reasons for our lack of speed. Firstly, the tech priests Jim had duped were seriously hindering any pursuit. Secondly, our bloody escape from the station, and the news that we'd been the source of the quote-unquote psychic attack had really discouraged a few small independent-owned ships that didn't rely on Mechanicus to keep running. And finally, the locals' priorities had shifted drastically after the virulent fungal infection had started spreading through the station, driving men insane with visions and melting through just about anything. We actually felt a little bad about the whole warp fungus thing, but it really wasn't our fault. And it seemed like they managed to get it contained before the stuff ate more than an eighth of the station. Anyways, Hannah had been looking into the stuff after the Marines had stumbled into it, and she was pretty sure that it would die off, or at least lose its hallucinatory properties, without frequent exposures to the warp. So it would probably work out in the end. And in a sort of term, it brought us a little more time to prepare for the upcoming weeks of warp travel. The last of our preparations were finished an hour before we were scheduled to re-enter the warp, and at Sarge's insistence, we all wandered down to the Gallow Field adjacent quarters for a pre-post-whatever mission briefing. Tink and Amy were off on one side, enjoying their usual pastime of antagonizing each other. The subject this time was the Tau vids Tink had acquired, specifically the ones that had been based on our exploits on the buffer world, and were supposedly earning us all sorts of royalties. Amy was loudly explaining that they were stupid, heretical, and concrete proof of Tink's perversion. Tink was holding that all this was untrue, and that Amy was just jealous that she hadn't been included in the vids on the account of being stuck on an island with a crazy Magos at the time. Doc was slumped over the table in the middle of the room. The medic had been on duty for nearly 20 hours before he'd been concussed and half crushed. And when we'd gotten back to the ship, he'd been allowed to take a break. He wound up spending another 20 hours hopped up on stims, helping get Gravis stowed away and treating all the armsmen who had been injured during the defense of the ship. Doc was completely out of it, and Nubby had taken the opportunity to draw some comical facial hair on him. The little trooper augmenting his doodles with a pyramid of furniture balanced on and around Doc, and was gleefully egging Tink and Amy on. Twitch had taped up what he claimed was the only accurate map of the occurrence border's tainted section along one wall. I say claimed, because none of us could read the damn thing, and looking at it for any length of time made our heads hurt. Twitch was alternately sticking pins in the map and talking to a servo skull with a det pad strapped onto it. Supposedly, the Cogitator Adept was watching the skull's vid feed and answering Twitch's questions via combi, but none of us could really be sure. Finally, Fumbles was sitting in a corner of the room, grimacing at a small Tau drone with a block of white material strapped onto it. Theo was sitting at the far end of what was definitely a blast shield, excitedly taking notes. None of us were really paying much attention to Sarge when he finally arrived, since Amy was chasing Tink around the furniture pile at that point. But that changed when Sarge dropped a large crate he was carrying with a hollow-sounding boom. Nubby recognized the crate, slided it away at an appreciable fraction of the speed of light, and Fumbles, who could taste the rage boiling off Sarge, rather more literally vanished from sight. Before either of them could make their escape, Sarge barked an order to Twitch, who pressed a big red button on the wall marked Panic. As the exit sealed and a few dozen proximity mines activated, the foul-smelling blur that was Nubby changed direction and vanished through the only door left, which led to the bathroom. He locked the door behind him. Sarge ignored the bathroom door and had a hard look at the corner where Fumbles was whispering to Theo to shut up about amazing readings and hold still. He turned his attention to the rest of us and, with a horrible fixed grin, asked for a status report. Twitch and Amy hesitantly reported about half of the boarders trapped in the tainted area had been killed, captured, or found dead. The rest were either holed up in areas too dangerous to pursue, disappeared into the rat's nest of corridors, or just outright vanished. Patrols and traps have been set to contain the demonic feeding frenzy that will occur in those areas when we enter the warp. Tink followed this up with a report on the generally good condition of the cells after the overhaul, and confirmation that everything was ready to entering the warp. Finally, Doc was posed with a stick until he regained enough consciousness to confirm that Gravis was still alive, and that he looted enough medical supplies that would keep him that way for a few weeks. Sarge digested the 3 reports for a few seconds, then poked Doc awake again. In an almost gentle voice, he asked the medic if he knew how Gravis' other half was doing because Sister Valerie couldn't find the freezer crate with the Space Marine's legs anywhere. Doc's tired brain kicked into overdrive and dredged up an image of a dented and bullet-pocked crate being pulled off of him and tossed to the side. He swore, attempted to leap to his feet, and was buried in a pile of chairs around him that collapsed. Tink, exhibiting all the tact and self-preservation instincts of a societally retarded lemming, burst into laughter. Sarge's attention immediately shifted to Tink. He opened the crate he carried in and took out the manifest taped to its lid and skipped down to the sections labeled Miscellaneous. His false grin completely gone, Sarge asked Tink if he knew where 1 data state, Fetichucha pattern, 1 Astartes grav chute and grapple harness, 2 single-shot grad flares, and 1 Mark 7 power armor helmet could be found. Tink's poker face lasted until the helmet was mentioned, and he involuntarily glanced towards where Spot was sitting. He looked back to find that Sarge had somehow teleported across the room and was now practically nose to nose with him. Then the shouting started. Of course, despite all the shouting and the part where he dragged Nubby out of the bathroom and held him in the air by 1 leg, Sarge wasn't really all that angry. Even though he'd grown rather stodgy since his promotion, he was still a guardsman, and he knew all about the importance of recycling. The truth was that, after how badly our resupply mission had gone, he just needed to shout at someone, and the way that we scavenged, disassembled, sold, or just plain lost a Space Marine's worth of war gear and legs was as good an excuse as any. We put up with Sarge's stress-relieving tantrum and thank the Emperor he didn't find out about what happened to the power sword had actually been traded for. I mean, Theo claimed that the chunk of Wraithbone was extremely valuable and the key to all sorts of psychic engineering, but he didn't actually have any idea how it worked and or what he was going to do with it. I mean, Sarge finding out that we'd lost the power sword because our captive Xenos wanted to commit some science on a spooky rock would have resulted in some real shouting. So once Sarge had started feeling better and had mandated that Sister Valerie was now in charge of Gravis's bolter and what was left of his helmet, he brought the rest of us up to date on what he, the adepts, and the captain had decided. The gist of it was that we hadn't appropriated enough fuel to reach the system where Oak's lab was, so we were going to have to make another stop and would offload Gravis, send a message to Oak, and repair whatever damage the Xanthrope had caused by that point while we were at it. Our response to this news was conflicted at best. We knew that we'd want another pit stop by that point, but we really didn't want to go through all that shit again. And since the astropaths were telling everyone that we were Inquisition impersonation heretics, it seemed inevitable. Sarge assured us that he, or at least the smarter people that worked for him, had figured out a solution though. The theory was that the astropath's lie would catch up to the attention of the Inquisition pretty quickly, and they'd send out a team to investigate what had happened on the station. Unless the paths managed to purge all records of our visit, which would probably require killing pretty much everyone in the Administratum from the prefect on down, it'd be relatively easy for the Inquisition to identify us based on the vid records of Sarge and our ship, and determine that the astropaths were full of shit. And then, after a judicious amount of purging, they sent out a follow-up sector-wide message to clear our names. The nearest Inquisition outpost was 5 days away from the station, so call it a week to hear about the problem and travel to the station, another week to sort things out and send the all-clear, and a third week just to be safe. The captain had mapped out a route that wouldn't be too far off course and would take us to a nice, developed Imperial system with an Inquisitional outpost of its own, just in case, in the about 3-week time. We'd dewarp really far out. So if the Xanthrope did its head explodey thing again, it probably wouldn't kill anyone, and then discreetly venture into comms range of the planet to make sure everything was okay before attempting to dock. There was a nice, sensible plan, and we all had to do was keep the Xanthrope contained and Gravis alive for 3 weeks of warp travel. Everyone, except Twitch, accepted that it was the best option available, and that we'd all take off to our last preparations. 2 hours later, the Yellowfield kicked into gear, the warp drive tore a bloody hole into the fabric of reality, and what we fervently hoped was our second to last warp journey with our stupid psychic bug began. All in all, everything into account, and relatively speaking, the trip went well. You know, by current border standards. Especially if you ignore all the ominous stuff with ghost Tyranids. Doc, per usual, spent most of the trip in the medbay, looking after Sergeant Gravis. The bisected Space Marine's condition wasn't good. The Tyranid bioweapon that had been introduced into his system was unquestionably alive, and was constantly attacking what remained of his organs with a wide variety of poisons. Gravis's Space Marine biology was fighting back, but was seriously hindered by the gross trauma he'd suffered, not to mention the loss of those organs in his lower torso. The only thing keeping Gravis alive was his power armor's automated Medicae system, a large pile of life support machinery, and the regular aid from Doc or Sister Valerie. Since he didn't have an entire medbay to run, Doc handled Gravis most of the time. Sister Valerie covered for him when he was occasionally needed elsewhere for more combat-oriented medical duties. And after a week of increasing grumpiness on both their parts, the senior subordinate was put in charge for the night shift. Anyways, between Doc's steadily increasing experience treating the torsified Space Marine and the large amount of medical supplies we'd quote-unquote requisitioned from the way station Illuminatum Primaris, Gravis was kept, if not stable, at least only gently teetering on the brink of death. Initially, that is. While Docs babysat Gravis, Sarge evaluated his performance during the supply run. He was reasonably happy with the way things had gone after everything had fallen apart, but it seemed to him that the real interrogators would have been able to keep things from spiraling out of control in the first place. He eventually came to the uncomfortable conclusion that his current social skills were rather lacking, and since the Emperor, or at least his Holy Inquisition, had dumped him into a role requiring them, he was going to have to fix that. With an incredible amount of reluctance, Sarge visited the Diplomacy Adept's quarters and asked for a few lessons in the arcane art of talking to people without shouting. The Diplomacy Adept found teaching Sarge to be rather difficult, mostly because our fearless leader was so set in his ways. In Sarge's book, deception and disguise were accomplished by using stuff like helmets on a stick, camo paint, and smoke grenades. Inquiry and intimidation shared a definition and involved little if any talking on his part, and the pages that covered blather and charm had been removed to make more space for the chapter that covered command. Regardless of the difficulty involved in reversing a lifetime's worth of sergeanty perceptions, though, the two of them did make some progress as we traveled. Admittedly, it was very slow progress and involved an awful lot of yelling, but progress nonetheless. For their part, Tink and his fellow xenoculturalists made some progress of their own during the voyage. The wonder team of Theo, Jim, and Tink were in charge of Xanthrope Containment, with the occasional assistance from the Xeologist Adept and Hannah, if she was hiding from her prom-prone tech acolytes in the cells. They refurbished everything in record time before we entered the warp, and afterwards things had gone surprisingly smoothly. Thanks to all the parts Nubby had acquired, the psi suppressors, shielding, the warp shroud had all been repaired and improved to the point where they were very nearly within the minimum recommendation strength of containing a Delta-level psyker during warp travel, and the stasis field was working perfectly for a change. All that had to be done in the cells was a bit of daily inspection and maintenance, which was always carried out quickly because the Xanthrope had acquired an unsettling presence ever since Sarge's partially slagged shield had gotten wrapped around its head. It was hard to shake the feeling that, despite the stasis field, the eyes under the metal were watching you. Of course, the reduced maintenance requirements of the cell meant the nerds were able to spend more time on other things. Other things, in this instance, translated to helping with important ship maintenance in Jim's case, and committing all sorts of tech heresy and Tink and Theo's. Well, actually, you couldn't really call what Theo was doing tech heresy. It was more a case of tech heathenism, in him being a Xenos and all. He was quite fixated on the piece of wraith bone we acquired, and spent every scrap of his free time tinkering with it. Some days he'd be wiring it to every device in the cells, others he'd just mount it on top of a drone and trail fumbles through the ship. And occasionally he would be seen wandering around with the big white block strapped to his head like a demented hat. Tink said it was very scientific. Jim and Hannah refrained from commenting, and the rest of us were just glad it kept the mouthy little Xenos busy. Tink, deprived of his helmet he had cannibalized to upgrade Spot, and perhaps motivated by a sense of shame at his inappropriate behavior, not likely, dedicated his time to a more practical project, the damaged Emperor-sized stealth shuttle. During our Xanthrope acquiring trip, the ship's tech acolytes had finished defungusing it, but after it had just been left in to sit in the shuttle bay on account of how completely non-functional, the fungus had eaten away a lot of armor and stealth material, and had pretty much destroyed the landing gear. But the real problem was how much of the spores had gotten into the shuttle circuitry. Some of the best piloting, navigation, and stealth control systems a Forge World could make had been reduced to hunks of corroded metal and silicon. Jim and Hannah had declared that the shuttle was unfixable without the aid of a fully stocked manufactorum and access to the shuttle's blueprints. Tink, however, saw the shuttle as both a challenge and an opportunity. and has snuck a few parts in both Imperial and Xenos Origin which had nothing to do with Psychic Containment into the list he'd given Nubby. When he found out about the project, Sarge briefly considered yelling at Tink for scavenging more Emperor-sized stuff, but decided it did technically count as repairing the shuttle, and we were already up to our eyes in Xenotech heresy anyways. Also, there was a chance we'd get a working stealth shuttle out of it. For their part, Jim and Hana just ignored all mentions of the shuttle and added the bay as to his list of places the tech acolytes weren't allowed to go. And the rest of us didn't have any input on the subject because we were either busy with Gravis or dealing with increasing levels of warp activity on the occurrence border's tainted areas. The initial high volume of anomalies and incursions had been expected. The things that usually discorporated after finding the tainted sections devoid into anything living that swarmed the trapped borders and grown strong. Several varieties of warp beasts, minor demons, reanimated corpses, and what Nubby would tell anyone who'd listen was a bloodthirster, despite the lack of height, axe, and wings. Had tried to claw their way into the more habitable sections of the ship during their first few days of transit. Thanks to the fact that we'd known the general location of the borders, the unholy horrors that come through to find numerous traps, swarms of debt-packed armed suicide skulls, the hardened priests and armsmen that made up the ship's watch. Oh, and a few well-armed guardsmen waiting for them. Even with prepared positions and numerical superiority, though, tackling warp creatures can be tricky. Over the 3 days it took the last of the borders to expire, the demons and the anomalies that manifested around them took a small but significant toll on the defenders. Some of the men were torn apart, others went insane. An unlucky few ran afoul of the occurrence border's chronic mechanical problems, and one or two forgot to check what was on the other side of the door before stepping through it. Of course, none of us were on the casualty list. Prior experience with this sort of thing, not to mention better quality weapons and a rather pragmatic approach to questions like, "Do you think that thing with the tentacles is still in there?" meant that we had made it through without significant injury. Significant injuries and close calls are a different matter, mind you. Something in the third wave of demons threw Fumble's powers out of whack and caused a few burns and bruises for everyone present. And there was a hairy moment when Twitch barely stopped Amy from stepping through a door that had inexplicably opened into one of his minefields. After that, one of Nubby's augmentic feet had to be plasma cut off to replaced on account he tried to kick a nurgling in the Nagglers. Oh, and the one time Doc came down to help with casualties, a priest he had been treating tried to eat his face and he had to be exorcised. See, clubbed into unconsciousness, using his own book of holy verses. Anyways, things calmed down after the third day, and once the various bits and pieces had been incinerated, jettisoned, or tossed back into the tainted sections, the bulkheads were resealed and everyone got back to their usual routine. Unfortunately, things didn't stay calmed down. Over the next few days, reports started filtering in of creatures haunting the corridors near the tainted areas. This wasn't unusual, and in and of itself, since every time the navigator hit a bump in the warp, stuff would leak through all over the ship, and there had just been a demonic incursion there to boot. But the witness reports were worrying. They matched the ones we'd received during our previous week of warp travel. Last time, Amy, Twitch, Nubby, and Fumbles had tracked down the Brahm to an infestation of what had appeared to have been Tyranids. It turned out that they weren't proper Nids, though, since shortly after they'd been killed, the bug's remains had started to reform in a distinctly warpy fashion, and then sort of vanished when we finally dewarped. We decided that the whole thing had just been some sort of warp phenomena caused by the psychic contamination cells failing. and the Xanthrope sort of passively screwing with reality. This explanation was ruined by the fact that, despite the cells being all fixed up, the Warpinids had come back. Or maybe they hadn't. It was a bit of a mess. The problem was that, this time, the Tyranid-shaped creatures that Nubby had drawn out with his damsel in distress routine were a little different. They had an appearance and behavior that could be best described as ghost-like. Not ghost-like as in sneaky, but ghost-like as in like a ghost. Literally. Now, the occurrence border was practically littered with warp ghosts, but human ones. For the most part, they just wandered around reenacting their lives and deaths, with the occasional bout of unsettling whispering and screaming thrown in. They were harmless, by and large, and even provided decent entertainment on slow days. But that could change if someone or something managed to get their attention and drag them into sync with what passed for reality. Anyways, the Tyranids we found, literally haunting the fringes of the tainted areas, displayed all the signs of being warp ghosts. Except, Tyranid ones. They sort of milled around in the shadows, drifting through walls, making clicking noises at each other, and gnawing at stuff that wasn't there. Until we got too close, or had fumbles poke 'em. Then every ghost in the area would swarm in around the agitated one, and become an awful lot more solid until a few bolts of plasma blew them into black and green smoke. At first, the ghost Tyranids were just puzzling. Based on the little we knew about the warp, and what information our xenologist adept could provide, it shouldn't have been possible. Your average Nid doesn't have a mind, much less a soul, and those are pretty much requirements for being a ghost. Otherwise, the warp would be littered with ghost bricks, trees, rocks, whatever. Everyone agreed that something odd was going on, but no one could figure out exactly what it was. At first, we just blamed the Xanthrope, but Jim and Theo checked and it couldn't detect any psychic energy leaking out of the cells and fumbled to back them up. Other theories were raised, such as the ghost Nids being a psychic projection built upon the crew's collective unconscious fear of Tyranids, or them being the result of the hive mind reaching across the warp to smite us, or everything being caused by the ancient heathen insectoid idol stored in cargo bay E-TAC 71/3, which had driven all who looked upon it insane. These were all shot down for various reasons, such as the fact that, according to Old Bill, the idol's various limbs had been holding up a plasma conduit for 13 years now without any significant problems, to which of course held fast to his theory that the Tyranid aboard the hive ship, which had been sucked into the warp by the size vortex bomb, had made an alliance with the demons of chaos, and an unstoppable tide of demonids would rampage across the galaxy. No one but Amy bothered to argue with him, and in the end the rest of us decided that the ghost Tyranids were probably still somehow the Xanthrope's fault, despite all evidence to the contrary. To return to the point though, the ghost Nids were puzzling. At first. It wasn't because something that happened which explained everything. It was because they quickly became far too serious a problem to waste time actually thinking about it. The number of ghost Tyranid sightings quickly rose, as did the number of attacks. We tried to nip the problem in the bud. Of course, a busy 2 days had been spent antagonizing ethereal Hummergots into solidity, and then shooting them. Unfortunately, they didn't stay dead, even when we got the Confessor himself to come down and wave his sensor around after we shot them. It'd take a few hours, but eventually the bug that Fumbles claimed was the one that drifted back into the spot where it killed it and resumed its seemingly random wandering. An expedition into the tainted areas to see where they were coming from was proposed, but after some careful thought, we decided that we didn't actually want to die horribly in a twisted nightmare of non-Euclid geometry and bug-shaped warp monstrosities. We might have really considered it if the ghost Tyranids had seemed interested in launching attacks on the rest of the ship, but as far as we could tell, they were content just to sort of hang out. Over time, the steadily increasing number of ghost bugs would result in them wandering deeper into the ship, but otherwise they stayed put unless someone got near them. Lacking any viable solution, or the motivation to take real risks to find one, the captain agreed with our decision to just keep a kill zone around the tainted area and contain the apathetic ghost Tyranid menace. The containment strategy wasn't sustainable in the long run, since the number of bugs was inexorably increasing, and they were able to expand in 3 dimensions as well as go through walls too. But we were pretty sure that if we gave a little ground when the numbers got too high, it'd work long enough for us to reach our next resupply point. Also, if things got really bad, we could just de-warp and sort things out at the expense of a few days of travel time. So, since there wasn't any immediate crisis, we settled into a slightly more stressful than usual routine and got on with our lives. Amy assumed command of the entire lower aft portion of the defense. She didn't actually ask for permission or anything, mind you. She just walked down there and started bossing everyone around. The only reason that the captain and his master of arms didn't kick up a fuss about this blatant disrespect was that Amy was actually very good at this sort of thing, having been born and raised for infantry command before her career changed to inquisitional goon. The rest of us noticed that, despite how much she complained about the poor quality of her troops compared to her old regiment, Amy seemed far happier than she'd been since her disastrous mission with the half-mad Magos. Or, not happier, at least less prone to spontaneous violence. Since Twitch, not to put a too fine point on it, wasn't really sane enough to command a squad, much less an entire flank of the defense, his assistance to the containment effort was a bit more ad hoc. He scrambled around, shoring up defenses and setting up traps without any discernible rhythm or reason, and everyone else just had to adjust their deployments to fit. It was all surprisingly effective, though in retrospect it shouldn't have been. He'd spent more time patrolling the borders of the tainted areas than anyone except old Bill and his senior engineers, and he knew which spots were defensible and which weren't by heart. Initially, Nubby just sort of mooched around the various fronts, assisting with the supply effort. But since his partner in petty crime was the only psyker around who wasn't busy steering the ship, his profitable arrangement didn't last. He quickly discovered that Fumble's ability to sense the ghost nids from quite far ways away and through walls was invaluable, especially since he could share what he had sensed with anyone nearby. He was consistently in demand as a spotter, and Nubby was dragged along to act as backup and morale support. Just as been mentioned, the rest of us had things to do, and the ghost nid situation really didn't change that. I mean, if you stopped worked every time an army of warp-spawned insectoid spirits laid siege to your ship, you'd never get anything done. So we all just sort of muddled along, trying to hold everything together as the trip continued and things got progressively worse. In the case of Doc's treatment of Sergeant Gravis, quote, got progressively worse, is the perfect summary. The Space Marine's condition went steadily downhill, and not in the way Doc or Valerie had prepared for. There were seemingly random seizures, spikes in neuroactivity indicating horrible nightmares, inexplicable changes in behavior of the biotoxin, and even a few spontaneous mechanical failures in the life support machinery. It got to the point where Gravis watching was a 24-hour no distractions duty, because the second he was left alone, something would invariably go wrong. Doc, not being born yesterday, blamed all these problems on the warp in general, and the Xanthrope in particular, but he couldn't figure out why or how, and had no idea what to do about it. Lacking any proactive treatment ideas, aside from exiting the warp or killing the Xanthrope, Doc decided increasingly large portions of his time to Gravis watching, and developed a rather disturbing tendency to talk to the comatose space marine. Tasteless jokes about Valerie getting jealous aside, we began to worry about him. But we were getting near the end of our trip by the time things got really worrying, and he seemed to recover a bit after his theory about the Xanthrope being the cause was confirmed. Actually, it wasn't just Doc's theory that was proven. Our suspicions about there being a link between the ghost nids and the Xanthrope were confirmed too. What had happened was, 3 days out from our destination, nearly a quarter of the psi suppressors in the cell failed at once. That didn't come to a complete surprise, mind you. Even in stasis, the Xanthrope's mere psychic presence, not to mention the warp itself, wore down the machinery and the shielding that restrained it. Tink, Theo, and Jim had been dedicating more and more of their time to inspections and maintenance, but there was only so much that they could do given the general cudgeled-together nature of the cells. So they'd been sort of ready for something like this to happen, and had made sure that someone was always on duty. When the failure happened, Jim was right there to start fixing things, and both Theo and Tink had arrived within minutes to help. Sarge showed up too, but he didn't actually help in any meaningful way. He just really wanted an excuse to ditch the horrible self-inflicted purgatory of his diplomacy lessons. Anyways, during the 15 or so minutes of reduced psi suppression on the Xanthrope, the following happened. The spawn rate of the ghost nids drastically increased. A few higher forms started appearing. The entire swarm began acting far more in touch with reality and became significantly harder to kill. All sorts of warp phenomena occurred throughout the ship. The temperature on the main atmospheric regulator got stuck at 7 degrees. This was probably unrelated, but then we were blaming everything on the damn bug. Fumbles suffered some sort of combination hallucinatory and convulsive episode and wound up clawing at his face and breaking his goggles. The navigator sent us a very angry note about the importance of not distracting him while steering. Then Sarge Gravis caught fire. Again. So, yeah, it was a pretty unpleasant experience. Especially since it was actually a minor failure compared to some of the stuff that was broken during our last trip, and therefore raised all sorts of questions about the Xanthrope's power. Not that we had much time for pondering though, because the following 3 days were absolutely exhausting. Most of the problems caused by the failure were dealt with immediately. The suppressors were repaired without the Xanthrope breaking out of stasis and trying to kill everyone. Doc actually had a fire extinguisher ready and put Gravis out before the Eldritch Flames did any real damage, and handled everything else that went spontaneously wrong during the brief loss of suppression. Nubby managed to restrain Fumbles before he clawed out his own eyes, and got the Psyker to safety, and was able to even scrounge up another pair of extra large wielding goggles, which may or may not have had Bill's Do Not Steal written on them. Then lastly, thanks to the general retreat order by Amy and the captain, plus Twitch's suspiciously well-placed fallback points, relatively few men died in the temporary empowered ghost nids. Unfortunately, even though the ghost nids lost focus and weakened again after the site suppressors were back online, the increase in their numbers was permanent. Containment became significantly more difficult, especially since in some places the defenses had been pushed back to rooms that old Bill said were important to the running of the ship. It wasn't a good situation, but then again, it could have been worse. Both ammo and food were plentiful. It hadn't been snowing or raining aside from the occasional drizzle of supernatural blood, and there weren't any commissars. On the official Imperial Guard scale of horrible meat-grinding defenses, it was only about a 3. Of course, anything that even showed up on that scale isn't something you want to deal with while traveling through the warp. The question of whether to just de-warp in the middle of space and try to sort everything out was raised again, but since we were so close to our destination, Sarge and the captain decided that we could tough it out. The rest of us reluctantly agreed and put everything we could into holding out for 3 more days. Reinforcements were mustered from the crew. Those wounded who could still fight were put back in the line, including a rather shaken Fumbles. And our fearless leader, oh so regretfully, abandoned the last of his diplomacy classes to personally take over the nastiest piece of the line. Finally, Tink and Theo were told that regardless of how creepy being around the Xanthrope was and how important their pet projects were, they now lived in the cells. And horrible things would happen to their vids if another mechanical failure occurred. It was a heroic, terrifying, and heroism-filled 3 days, which really reminded us of our time in the Guard, though with less indiscriminate shelling and rather inferior brand of trenchmates. Not that the armsmen of the Occurrence border weren't good fighters, they just weren't Guardsmen. Anyways, complaints about troop quality aside, we managed to hold out without any more complete disasters. There were a few tense moments, such as when Tank got as far as reporting that a cascading suppression failure was imminent, before he figured out how to use his plasma gun as a backup battery. We would have congratulated him on his ingenuity, but it took him about half an hour to remember to tell us things had been stabilized and we weren't about to die. Another bad spot was when Sarge finally abandoned the forward power management, water purification, and toothpaste distribution room, only to have something break within its 5 minutes after he left. It took a 3-hour counteroffensive, spearheaded by all of us except Amy, to get old Bill up there to fix the thingy that got stuck in the whatsits. In the end, though, we made it. A few hours before original scheduled de-warp time, but not a second too soon, we arrived at the bastion of Imperial civilization, widely known as that system, with 2 planets and an inquisitional base that's pretty much on the way. No, not that one, the one with the blue star. As the Occurrence border left the warp, the massive swarm of ghostly Tyranids just faded away. It was actually sort of awkward for those of us on the line, and sheer paranoia kept everyone at their post for nearly an hour before victory was declared and we all went off to get some sleep. The only people left awake were those who'd been augmented past the need for the pathetic meatbag concept of sleep, and the poor bastards in charge. Sarge hiked his way up to the bridge to verify that we are in the correct system and that no stellar disasters, xeno invasions, or heretical uprisings were occurring in it, and sent a message to the Inquisitional base. Unfortunately, that last part proved unexpectedly difficult. Due to our recent problem with head-exploding waves of psychic energy, we came out of the warp at the edge of the system. Of course, the universe despises all rational planning, so the Xanthropes stayed completely quiet during the transition. And all our careful precautions accomplished nothing aside from leaving us several days of normal space travel away from our destination. In fact, we were so far out that our sensors could barely even pick up the largest ship and stations around the planet, and it would be days before we got into box range. This annoyed Sarge, who wanted to get started on the whole process of proving our identity and requesting aid so he could stop worrying. The captain sympathized with him, and rather sarcastically asked Sarge if he wanted to try to make a micro-warp to get closer to the planets. Sarge told him to go fornicate with a waterfowl, and then wandered off to try to nap away his paranoia. The rest of us weren't too concerned about the travel time, since moving through normal space was downright relaxing by our standards. If left to our own devices, we'd probably been spending the entire time asleep, drunk, or watching heretical cartoons, but Sarge didn't approve of idle troops. After a mere 16 hours of sleep, he dumped everyone out of their nice warm bunks, gathered the entire team plus old Bill and Jim together, and began giving orders. The impromptu briefing started with Sarge informing us that Captain had spotted 3 ships of indeterminate size heading our way, and as per tradition, Twitch interrupted to tell everyone that he had a bad feeling about this. After a few minutes had been wasted on a half-comedic speculation, Sarge shared the captain's assurance that this was a perfectly normal response to how far out we warped in. He claimed that it was, in fact, a good thing since they'd be able to help us by passing our Vox message to the Inquisition base earlier than we'd expected. It'd still be over a day before we were in range, though, and in the meantime, there were things to do. Tink and Theo were told that their pet projects were still on hold until they could make sure that the systems in the cells were working fine and compiled yet another parts list. Doc, who was annoyingly chipper after his first real break from Gravis watching in over a week, was told to ditch the Marine on his girlfriend and get his gear ready. The adepts were told to do whatever adepty thing needed doing before we talked to whoever ran the local Inquisition base, except for the Cogitator adept, who was ordered to use his data thingy and concept to figure out where the ghost nids had been coming from. He responded with a lot of useless technobabble and complaints about not being a demonologist, dammit. But after Sarge glared at him for a while, he went off to his closet and got to work. Everyone else was ordered to get ready for a short expedition. A few hours later, the Cogitator Adept delivered a data slate containing what Twitch and Old Bill assured us was a map marking our 4 locations in the Occurrence Border's various tainted areas. The rest of us took their word for it, and Twitch was put in charge of deciphering it into 3-dimensional directions. Sarge chose the location of the lower aft tainted section as our first target, on the account of how it was near the other thing he wanted to sort out with the expedition, and we set out with Old Bill and his gaggle of engineers and tech acolytes in tow. Now, we called it an expedition and went in heavily armed, but outside of the warp, the tainted areas weren't that dangerous. Yes, they were still contaminated with warp energy, which manifested all sorts of phenomena, but they were generally minor things, like whispers, winds, flashes of movement, and the non-insectoid variety of ghost. The crutoids and other vermin which wandered into the area and wound up horribly mutated and occasionally possessed were only a minor inconvenience, and the warp entities that can survive in normal space without some kind of host are rare. Really, it was just a matter of carefully avoiding the mechanical hazards and the occasional persistent anomaly, such as the time loop on subdeck U3, the room stuck at 5 degrees Kelvin, the time loop in subdeck U3, the perpetual bouncing ball, and the time loop on subdeck U3. We reached the area that the Cogitator Adept had calculated as the center of the Ghostnid infestation without any incidents, more serious than a tech acolyte getting slightly electrocuted and Nubby getting stuck during an attempt to bypass a leaking plasma conduit via an air shaft. Unfortunately, when we got there, we didn't find any demonic portals, eldritch devices, Tyranid hives, or anything else we could cover with det packs. All we found at the geographic center of the Ghostnid infestation was a few empty rooms and corridors. We had Fumbles take a look around just in case, but while he claimed the area was slightly more tainted its surroundings, it seemed to him like it was just the side effect of being filled with Ghostnids for longer. We debated exploring the entire area, just on the off chance that it would accomplish something, but Old Bill asked us not to. So, lacking anything productive to do, we headed down to Cargo Bay E-TAC 71/3, home of a few dozen plasma conduits and an insanity-inducing ancient heathen insectoid idol that had been repurposed as an architectural support, operating on the theory that even if it wasn't related to a drug problem, it probably wasn't good to have a giant eldritch statue just sitting around in a warp-tainted cargo bay. We asked old Bill to figure out a way to disentangle the plasma conduits from the idol. No, not to study it, of course. That would be silly. We just wanted to make sure that the engines wouldn't explode or something when we destroyed the thing. Old Bill grumbled a bit about not fixing what isn't broken, but he and his boys threw a tarp over the thing's horrible mind-shattering visage and began scavenging replacement parts from the surrounding area. A few hours later, the various plasma conduits, pipes, and wires were being supported by a haphazard network of metal bands, clamps, crates of expired food, and 3 of the room's grab plates fastened to the ceiling. The tarp-covered idol was dragged to the center of the room, and a pair of melta-bombs that looked suspiciously like cross-side insignias on the sides were fastened to it. The horrible chittering screaming went on for quite a while, but it trailed away as we reached the edge of the tainted area, and nothing else really happened. Well, aside from the 11% drop in efficiency on Engine 6 and half of the aft sensors overloading. Old Bill said he told us so. By the time we got back from our expedition, the distance between us and the 3 approaching ships had closed to the bare edge of our Vox broadcasting range. Now that we were closer, our sensors had identified the ship as a Navy frigate and a pair of smaller SDF ships. So, Sarge, the captain, and the adepts decided not to mess around with subtlety and announce our identity and intentions off the bat. Remembering his recent lessons in the importance of stance, stress, and overall first impressions, Sarge scrounged together a replacement for the inquisitional costume and evil goon uniform which had been gleefully abandoned in a men's restroom garbage bin. After he more or less ripped Duck's evil goon uniform in half during his attempt to make it fit, he settled for wearing one of the captain's spare uniforms and hung his interrogator's rosette in clear view. Suitably outfitted, Sarge then spent nearly 2 hours with the old diplomacy adept recording a 2-minute vid which primarily consisted of his name and rank, a request that his message be forwarded to the local inquisitional base, and the digital authorization code from his rosette. This arduous task completed, he joined the rest of us for a few game of cards while the message scrawled across the system at an annoyingly slow speed of light. 4 hours and several thrones lost to Nubby and fumbles later, it occurred to us that we really should have gotten a response by then, and we all trooped up to the bridge to see if something interesting was happening. We arrived just in time to hear one of the sensor techs report that all 3 approaching ships had increased their acceleration, and 4 more had left orbit. Twitch informed everyone that he had a really bad feeling about this. An emergency meeting for everyone who could contribute to a serious conversation in our options were called, and the rest of us invited ourselves along the way. There was some initial complaining by Jim, the adepts, and other such stuffy people about how the whole meeting was pointless, since no one actually knew anything useful about the situation, so all that anyone could do was make wild guesses based on hearsay and unsupported speculation. That sounded fine to us, because it was how we made most of our decisions, and everything typically worked out, so we ignored their whining. The initial topic of conversation was just what in the Emperor's name was going on, and if there was any chance we could sort it out. All theories stated that the approaching ships were friendly and there was just some sort of inexplicable reason why they couldn't talk to us. We're, immediately thrown out on the grounds that the universe doesn't work that way. And Twitch's theory on the local Navy forces had been taken over by advanced forces of demonoids or possibly commandos was dismissed for similar reasons. The general consensus we arrived at was that the locals were following the astropathic kill order that had been sent out by the insane choirmaster, which had probably included something like disregard any messages they send, especially ones containing inquisitional authorization codes. This raised a bunch of new questions, though, the primary one being, why the hell hadn't the Inquisition rescinded that order yet? Since it was unimaginable that the Inquisition hadn't noticed a sector-wide astropathic message to kill someone, much less a whole ship of people who were in their records as Inquisitional agents, we felt that an investigation into the incident on the station had at least been started. There was, of course, a remote possibility that whoever they sent to investigate had completely botched things and either swallowed the choir master's obvious lies or had been offed by the locals. But that seemed unlikely. Despite our personal experiences, the Inquisition on the whole is rather notorious for its incredulity and competence. Doc suggested that the investigator ship could have been lost in the warp, or that other warp travel-related shenanigans had occurred, such as our own warp journey taking only a few hours of real time as opposed to 3 weeks we'd experienced. The captain shot down that last explanation, claiming that to be absolutely certain for some technical reason that 3.5 weeks of real time had passed, but allowed that Doc had a point about the dangers of the warp travel delaying the investigation. The diplomacy adept also raised a valid point, which was that given the time it would have taken to investigate the station and our direct route, no Inquisitional couriers would have reached the system before us. This meant that any quote-unquote "no, these astropath exploding people are not heretics, don't kill them" order from the Inquisition would have been sent out via astropath, so there was a rarely real possibility that a few things got lost in translation. For instance, the no, not, and don't. Both those explanations sounded good enough for us, but they didn't account for why the local Inquisition base wasn't doing anything, and that was more pressing concern at present. The whole reason we'd picked the system as our destination was because of the presence of the Inquisition base. They'd expected them to be able to help sort things out if, as had apparently happened, word of our incidents hadn't reached the system yet. Okay, it wasn't like they ran the local navy, they were just a small Ordus Hereticus outpost. They were probably a few buildings full of adepts who kept track of things, a handful of stormtroopers who hung out waiting for the next emergency, and maybe 1 or 2 local inquisitors if they weren't off purging heretics in another system at the moment. Size aside though, they should have noticed half the ships in the system moving out at once, taken an interest, and been forwarding our messages. In the end, we put it down to massive incompetence. This wasn't a very good explanation, but the only one we could think of that was some shadowy cabal of astropaths secretly controlling half the sector via carefully manipulating some information, which was just silly. Seriously, you ever heard of a bunch of astropaths secretly controlling anything? They were just all nuttier than squirrel poo, and prone to randomly exploding. The argument about whether the idiot running everything was the person currently running the Inquisition base or someone in the local navy who was stonewalling them for some arbitrary reason was getting rather spirited when it was brought to an end by the arrival of the Occurrence Border's navigator. The tall, cadaverous man stalked in, probably attracted by all the shouting just a few rooms away from his sanctum, and informed us that we were all blunt-minded idiots. No one but Amy took much offense to this. In our experience, this was just the navigator's way of saying hello, and we all waited to hear why we were all a bunch of borderline retards. It turned out that what was happening was obvious, and he could have told us it would have happened if we thought to ask him. That statement right there is a classic example of why no one likes navigators. Our ship had just popped out of the warp at an odd location, positively reeked with warp taint, and had a powerfully unrestrained Tyranid psychic signature emanating from it. The Occurrence Border was a textbook example of a gene stealer infested ship looking to infiltrate a system. There was a short argument between the Navigator and Tink about whether the Xanthrope was unrestrained or not. Tink ultimately lost because if the bug was properly restrained, we wouldn't have been up in our asses in ghost Tyranids for the last few weeks. But the Navigator did eventually amend his statement to, and I quote, partially restrained by a bunch of incompetents, heretics, and Xenos. Anyways, the rest of us acknowledge that this was a good enough explanation as any, since the excessive paranoia seemed a bit more likely than a plain incompetence where the Inquisition was concerned, and asked the Navigator if he had any ideas of how to deal with such a situation. He suggested that we all get the hell out of the system before we all get killed, and make sure our next stop was somewhere where we personally knew people in power who could smooth things out for us. This suggestion did not go over well with Doc, Tink, or anyone else really. In the end, despite all the complaining, Sarge and the captain decided to follow the Navigator's advice. Doc's statement that Gravis would not survive another serious warp journey with his Xanthrope was noted, as was Tink's list of things the cell that desperately needed replacement parts to continue functioning correctly, but those were future problems, and the incoming ships were very current ones. Once that critical decision was made, the entire mob relocated to the map room, where most of us just complained and made unhelpful suggestions while Sarge, the captain, and our adepts tried to find a suitable destination. To our surprise, we actually knew a fair number of people who would be able to help us. There was Inquisitor Oak, of course, as well as a few of our former interrogators, an overweight cross-dressing xenophile, the Rupert, and a few tech priests of various ranks. On top of that, the captain and the adepts were able to supply a few Navy officers and Inquisition contacts. Amy grudgingly admitted her mother would help if she asked, and Nubby said he knew a guy who was technically a planetary governor. The problem was that most of these people tend to move around a lot, and the ones who didn't weren't anywhere near our end of the Ultima Segmentum. Even without all the complications of making a long warp journey with Gravis and the Xanthrope, we just didn't have enough fuel to reach any of them. Mind you, if we had an astropath, as opposed to a headless corpse in the morgue, and a sanctum covered with bits of blood, brain, and bone, we might have gotten lucky and been able to track one of the mobile ones down nearby. But in that case, we could have just sent a message asking our boss to sort all this stuff out for us. After we examined the map and determined that no one helpful was in a 4-day travel range, the captain raised some less savory options. The discussion turned into what was or wasn't piracy, and whether any of the nearby systems were too small to have a naval defense or astropaths, but developed enough to have a supply of fuel. Sarge began to zone out as he imagined just how unpleasant his post-mission interview with the Inquisitor was going to be, and then he overheard Tink pestering the Navigator. Tink asked if it was possible to, quote-unquote, coast in the warp like fuel-conscious ships did in normal space, and thereby extend our range enough to reach the nearest guaranteed friendly system, which was unfortunately one of the inhabited ones by Nubby's guy. The Navigator made some sneering remarks about the Blunt's inability to truly understand the shifting nature of the warp, and admitted that yes, you could trade time for fuel to a certain point. As the rest of us checked whether this would allow us to reach anyone who hadn't been described as, and quote, like a planetary governor, but without the actual planet, and maybe a bit more slavery. Sarge thought back to our original travel plans. He asked the Navigator whether we could stretch 4 days of fuel to reach a destination a week and a half away, specifically the Ornos Xenos research facility that had ordered the Xanthrope. He got a flat no. That would have been the end of it right then and there, and things might have turned out very differently. But the cogitator adept was listening in and simultaneously responded with a maybe. That sparked a heated argument, which included a lot of talk about warp currents and something about problems with the shortest paths. None of us were really following it, except for maybe Tink, but the no and maybe slowly turned into probably assuming fuel efficiency is static, the currents are where they say they are on the map, and there are no storms, and we can survive 3 more weeks of warp travel. Well, there was a bit more debate after that, but Sarge had made up his mind. He was well and truly done with this shit. There would be no more stops, no more hair-raising escapes with misguided Imperial forces hard on our heels, and no more bloody diplomacy. He could take 3 more weeks cooped up with Xanthrope and fighting off waves of its ghostly minions, as long as in the end he'd be able to dump both it and the problem of the crazy astropaths on whichever Inquisitor had ordered the damn bug. This decision met a certain amount of resistance, primarily from Doc, Tink, and the captain, who were tremendously worried about Gravis, the cells, and the really real chance of running out of fuel short of our destination, respectively. Unfortunately, despite how undeniably bad Sarge's plan was, no one besides Nubby thought any of the other options were much better. And anyways, we were guardsmen, and Sarge was in command. Once he made a decision, all we could really do was complain and try to figure out how to make his plan work. The captain went off with his subordinates and the navigator to plot our route, and informed us that we had 5 hours before the approaching ships forced us to warp. Tink and Jim immediately ran down the cells and began frantically working with Theo to overhaul all the stuff they'd originally been planning to replace. Sarge and Amy and Twitch sat down and began hashing out a defensive plan that would take advantage of the Ghost Nid's apathy when no one was around to provoke them, and the fact that they didn't launch any real flanking attacks. Nubby dragged Fumbles off to help him relocate several of his stashes to areas that wouldn't be overran when shitstorm resumed, and Doc carefully examined Gravis' condition, evaluated his chances of keeping the Marine alive for 3 more weeks of warp travel, spent a while locked in a bathroom alternating between screaming and crying, and then decided that something drastic needed to be done. Doc made his way down to the Psyker containment cells, but thankfully didn't go with his first idea, which had been to just kill the Xanthrope and hope Oak and his research buddy were in a good mood when they found out. Instead, he poked his nose into the small, currently unused side rooms that had originally been used to hold captive Psyker children, and checked if any of the undersized stasis beds had been left over after Tink and Theo had combined a few into one big enough to hold the Xanthrope. He had a moment of panic when all the cells except for the one packed with debris were empty. But when he asked Theo what had happened, the little Xenos explained that they'd pulled all of them out during the project and the leftovers were just in a closet somewhere. Doc knew the inevitable fate of expensive pieces of equipment that got left in unmonitored closets. So he skipped the scavenger hunt and just calmed Nubby and asked which one of the stashes the stasis bed had wound up in. Nubby wasn't keen on parting with his loot, but eventually came around to Doc's way of thinking when the medic started explaining all the horrible things that would happen to him if Gravis died. One of the 5 leftover stasis beds were hauled over to the medbay, where Doc and Valerie spent several minutes trying to figure out how to fit the upper half of a 3-meter-tall killing machine into a stasis bed size for children of ages 3 to 12. It was obvious from the start that Gravis' armor and life support machinery wouldn't fit, but it was quickly established that even without those, he was still far too large. In the end, Doc was forced to admit that the only way it would work was if they removed Gravis' arms, shoulders, and a good portion of one of his sides. Sister Valerie did not approve of this course of action. There was a short argument between Doc and his girlfriend over whether being slowly hacked apart with a diamond-edged bone saw while struggling to fight off an alien biotoxin was guaranteed to be fatal or not. Nubby, who had tagged along and hoping to get his loot back, decided to be helpful at this point and suggested that Gravis didn't need to be cut up before being put into the bed, as the stasis field could take care of that for them. He was in the middle of a rather gleefully recounting what had happened to a cargo servitor that had been caught half in the field during Tink and Theo's experiments on combining the stasis units, when Doc realized the obvious solution to the problem. A few minutes later, Doc was down in the cell screaming at Tink to stop messing around with the side suppressors and get to work on combining the 5 leftover stasis beds into one large enough to hold Gravis. Tink was pretty sure that his current task was a little more important though, so there was a bit of an argument, and things quickly devolved into the point where Doc was holding the techie up by the collar and shaking him. Jim stepped in at this point, applied a few thousand volts of enforced calmness into Doc's lower back. He explained to the twitching medic that his request had been noted, and building the stasis unit would take a few days and would therefore be worked into the schedule of critical maintenance on the cells. Doc was in no position to argue with Jim, or walk for that matter, so he accepted the cogboy's promise that it would be a top priority, and was dragged back to the medbay by Nubby and Fumbles. He felt slightly better when Sister Valerie called him a genius and promised to kiss him later when she wasn't covered in bodily fluids. 2 hours later, we sent out a final message to everyone in the system, which was pretty much a detailed list of why they were all idiots and or assholes, and disappeared into the warp before the approaching ships could follow us. All you could really say for the first few days of that warp journey was that they went better than the last few of our previous one. For a starter, our worst case scenario, for conservative values of worst, hadn't come true. The ghost nids hadn't just popped back into existence in the same place where they'd last dewarped. Our brief stint in normal space had reset their counter or whatever, and the bugs were only appearing in the tainted areas, although at a rate significantly higher than they had been before. Spawn rate aside though, our defensive situation was much better than it had been, and the cells were in pretty good condition too. Thanks to the heroic repair effort of Tink, Jim, and Theo, the side suppressors took the strain of entering the warp without failing, and the devices seemed to be functioning better than they had before. There were some concerns about their power output though, since, as mentioned, the Ghost Nid's spawn rate has been higher than it had been, and there was also more minor phenomena occurring throughout the ship, as well as the increase in number of IGPs, that's inexplicable Gravis problems. This bothered Tink immensely, since his readings said everything in the cells was working fine, at least for now, and there weren't any psychic leakage around the cells either. Admittedly, Theo and Jim's side detector consisted of a wraithbone block on a stick and a creepy ornate servo skull that had been periodically fed live rats, but they seemed pretty confident in their readings. Anyways, Tank and the other techies didn't get to pondering the ghost nids for long, even though the normal space repairs had bought them some breathing room. The lack of replacement parts meant that every fix was a horrible time-consuming cudgel, and Doc made sure that every minute of their free time was dedicated to putting together Gravis' stasis field. Things were more or less calm for the first 3 days of our efficiently slow warp journey. We kept track of the ghost nids, but didn't waste any effort in engaging them, and Tink and Theo made some serious progress, and Doc managed to stay very positive about this whole situation while struggling with Gravis' mounting medical problems. The first suppression failure happened on the 4th day. The increase in phenomena in the ghost nid spawning was pretty much a repeat of last time, but the other aspects of the failure went differently. For one thing, we didn't lose any armsmen on the account of how ghost nids hadn't expanded to reach our defensive lines when the failure began. They sure as hell had reached them by the end, though. This time Fumbles did better too. He managed to retain consciousness through the whole thing, though was a little loopy afterwards, babbling about something of being all round and trying to find itself. Gravis, however, came off a lot worse. Doc and Valerie weren't able to figure out exactly what had happened, but the Space Marine's secondary heart wound up resembling a raisin and had to be removed. Once again, the techies managed to fix things, but that marked the end of the easy part of the trip. As the fight against the Ghostnids resumed, we realized that their spawn rate wasn't the only thing that had gotten worse over time. The bugs were definitely stronger and more aggressive than they had been during our last trip, and had begun to exhibit some new and worrying behaviors. 3 times in the following 2 days, sizable forces of Ghostnids coalesced in areas where they hadn't reached our lines yet, and then slowly wandered around the ship until they ran into our forces. We managed to beef up the defensive lines in time on all 3 occasions, but they were all difficult fights, and this change in attack pattern forced Sarge, Amy, and the captain to seriously reevaluate their plans. By the 6th day, it was becoming apparent that holding out for 2 more weeks was going to be close to impossible. The unexpected increase in the Ghostnid's strength and their new penchant for the occasional focused attack forced our lines back days ahead of schedule, and the initial ship-wide increase in phenomena we'd seen were getting worse. It was actually beginning to feel like the Galler field was failing, except old Bill wasn't certain it wasn't, and the usual whispers and blood seepage had been replaced with far-off chittering sounds and Tyranid ichor. It was obvious the Xanthrope was responsible, but it was still a mystery how, and we couldn't think of anything to do besides killing the bug or dewarping. Mind you, dewarping wasn't the same sort of emergency option it had been before. This was because the warp drive took a whole lot of energy to function, so it didn't actually have enough fuel to get back into the warp if we exited, much less go anywhere or dewarp again afterwards. So if we wanted to bail out of the warp, we were going to need to do it near a system that could provide fuel and handle all the risks that came with that. Still, the situation with the Ghostnids was getting bad enough that Sarge was really considering calling for a detour. Through the only chance coming up to do so was at least another 3 days of warp current coasting away. So the situation was bad, but there was at least one bright spot. Thanks to the time freed up by a lucky streak of only minor malfunctions in the cells, Tink and Theo had nearly completed Gravis' stasis field. In fact, they were just down to the last part, dealing with the power distribution, and it was proving rather tricky. Since they didn't want to waste time doing it all from scratch, the 2 of them went down to the cells to take a hard look at what they had done last time. That turned out to be a very good decision. Now, despite the Xanthrope being the focus of all this trouble, the 3 techies didn't actually pay much attention to it most of the time. For one thing, after Taint fixed the flickering problem, its stasis field had been working surprisingly well, and it would always be the devices scattered around the room that needed the maintenance. Secondly, the Xanthrope had gotten incredibly creepy after Sarge's slagged hull metal shield got wrapped around its head. It never moved, obviously, being in stasis and all, but you always felt like it was watching you under the metal, and the longer you looked at it, the worse it got. In retrospect, that was probably what some fancy-pants inquisitory super agent guy would have called a clue, but we were a little too busy for that shit. We just accepted that the metal-faced xenopsyker that looked like a cross between a fetus, a snake, and a cockroach was creepy and felt no need to examine said creepiness for a supernatural element. Anyways, all this meant that when Tink crawled under the stasis unit to poke around and asked Theo to watch the field for any flickers, it was actually the first time anyone had really looked hard at the Xanthrope since we re-entered the warp. After a minute or so, Theo asked Tink if he'd touched anything, and when the techie replied in the negative, the little Tau scientist explained that there was some sort of interference pattern inside the field. Tink looked at the focus array above his head, which looked pretty intact to him, and asked what the pattern had looked like. and whether it might be yet another psychic phenomena. Theo walked a circuit around the stasis unit, turned his head from side to side, and reported,
There's actually two focal points, both positioned right behind the Xanthrope. They're sort of black and smoky and shaped like wings?
We march. We march. We march. We march.